further now with Justin Robert Young, host of the Politics podcast, Daniel Lazar, journalist and author, and Charles Ortle, private investor and writer. Thank you for joining us on the programme, all of you. First to Justin. Now, what do you make of the timing of the Justice Department's antitrust case against Google? Do you think there might be a political motive hidden here?
There was some talk within the Justice Department that the timing of this was rushed, and you can certainly see some of the hallmarks of that in terms of the state attorneys general that were all Republican that signed on to this. There was broad bipartisan support for this particular antitrust action, though, however. So while the timing before the election might be something that is suspect, there's no doubt that there is broad bipartisan effort to try to bring some kind of antitrust case, not only to Google, but also to Amazon, Apple, and Facebook, probably within the next calendar year.
Coming over to you, Daniel, there are plenty of claims about Google manipulating search results to serve a political bias. Do you think there's any truth to them?
There probably is, but it's very, very hard to nail down because Google is constantly fiddling with its algorithms, and so they change from day to day. So it's very hard to know what the bias is. The left thinks it's being discriminated against. The right thinks the same thing. So it's just very hard to know. I'm very skeptical of this entire antitrust effort.
And to you, Charles, we've heard plenty of claims of foreign interference in the US, including from Russia. But is the possible interference of tech giants potentially much more of a concern?
Well, I actually see it daily in my own life in that I run a podcast with Jason Goodman on Crowdsource the Truth. A number of weeks ago, Stormin arbitrarily dropped from Facebook. All the videos in the archive, everything dropped from Facebook. Google, we think, is constraining the evolution of our results. And I would note that in the contrasting what happened with Hunter Biden's story, we need to think about the Christopher Steele dossier, which exploded across the world. It continues to get credence, despite having been utterly discredited at the outset by our own FBI. So, I mean, to me, it's crystal clear that whoever is operating these algorithms and operating these companies heavily favors, as does our mainstream media, the left and Democrats, and is pushing down back aggressively right now in ways that I think may very well suppress results and affect the 2020 election in this country.
Justin, coming back to you, Facebook, Google and Twitter previously vowed to prevent election interference through their platforms. To what extent do you think they've managed to fulfill that promise?
Is that
I think it was a promise that they couldn't, that they shouldn't have made, and they can't keep. Quite frankly, the idea that they were the reason that Donald Trump got elected is only as true as Donald Trump's ability to co-opt their platforms and use it as a medium, much in the same way that John F. Kennedy used television. He wagged the tail, or the tail wagged the dog, in terms of what he was saying on social media drove traditional media coverage, which had been cratering in the ratings. So the idea that there is anything other than maybe minor fringe cases of a bunch of Macedonian teens writing inflammatory headlines that get circulated on Facebook by your crazy uncle, so they wind up going to a page where they might accidentally click on a link to discount pharmaceuticals. I don't really know what Twitter or Facebook could have done. What they have instead done is made a horrifying promise that they can regulate truth. That is hard enough to do in a world that isn't politics, where disinformation is part of the game.
Daniel, we're all aware of this big scandal right now over Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, and the files from his laptop leaked to the New York Post. Twitter and Facebook have been actively blocking that story. Do you think they're justified in doing that?
No, of course they're not justified. It was an absolutely outrageous act. I mean, as one of your other guests said, I mean, Twitter and Facebook did not do a thing when the Christopher Steele dossier was circulating, and that was a pack of lies. So they showed a significant bias in going after the Hunter Biden disclosures. And I've read the Hunter Biden emails, and they strike me as perfectly valid, perfectly plausible. So I believe the story. And I think that Twitter and Facebook are deliberately trying to withhold information from the public in a clear effort to swing the election. Look, there are a lot of issues involved here. The Google case is one issue. Twitter and Facebook are another issue. But the point is that everybody is ganging up on social media. They're trying to push it this way and that. And the whole thing is just kind of madness. And I really think we'd all be a lot better if we left these private companies alone. I sound like a libertarian. I don't want to sound like a libertarian, but that's the position that I find myself moving towards.
Charles, staying with the Hunter Biden story and his prior dealings in Ukraine, it's now emerged that a former advisor to Joe Biden on Ukraine is now a global policy manager for content moderation at Facebook. Is that a conflict of interest there?
I think it's a massive conflict of interest. I mean, look, what we had in this country and many countries is the stifling of the independent mind, the attempted stifling by oligarchs in the tech industry and in the finance industry and our global media concerns. People do think for themselves. People on the right and the left look at the period 1988 to the present and see unregulated globalism and its attendant corruption enriching dynastic political families here in the United States and around the world. It rots. The traditional parties, the Democrats, Republicans, have not accomplished much. One might argue have destroyed much since 1988 in particular. And the surges that you see towards a Bernie Sanders, towards a Donald Trump in our country are surges of independent people who reject both parties and are demanding accountability from their leaders. I think what is happening in Twitter and Facebook is at the margins, but and it's completely wrong for Twitter and Facebook to have done what they did on the Hunter Biden story. Let's hope that this misstep actually triggers a massive counterreaction and elevates the story to the place where it needs to be focused upon.
Justin, do you think there needs to be legal changes to restrict the power of online platforms to decide what we can and can't read?
There's no doubt that what we call a Section 230 or safe harbor in America is something that does need to be thought of further. And while I don't know if necessarily reform on that law is the answer, I do think a new law might be. Quite frankly, we are moving at a startling pace in terms of all these platforms, and we don't have laws that really apply to them. If we had any kind of accountability with our elected representatives in Congress, both in the House or in the Senate, then maybe there could be a lane to carve out to say, we'll actually do something and think about a law that sets a fair standard for what can be expected from these platforms. But right now, I think the problem isn't what's legally acceptable from either of them. It's the fact that, again, they've made promises they can't keep, and they are trying to please their user bases based solely on the outrage of the moment. The fact that Twitter banned that Hunter Biden link for a couple days, then reversed it on Friday, and yet still the New York Post can't unlock their Twitter account is exactly all you need to know to show what kind of coherence exists inside of Twitter, which on this issue is non-existent.
And to you, Daniel, according to the US Media Research Center, within the last 2 years, Donald Trump was censored on social media at least 65 times compared to 0 for Joe Biden. Do you think this complies with the concept of fair election campaign?
No, there should not be any censorship at all. I mean, we should really adopt a very strict free speech standard here, which does away with censorship and opposes the very concept. But the important point is that the censorship is being imposed on Facebook and Twitter by the government. The government is afraid of these platforms. Liberals and Democrats are both pushing for a increased government regulation, and I think it's an assault on free speech. So I think that there should be as much free speech as possible, and that means there will be bad speech, but the only remedy for bad speech is good speech, more good speech.
Charles, in a Project Veritas undercover interview, a manager at Google has said the company is playing selective God on the US political scene, skewing results to benefit the Democrats. Does it sound accurate, plausible to you?
Absolutely does. When I do a lot of writing and researching, and when I try to find articles that I know of, just blandly putting them into Google search, they don't come up. When I tailor them, they do come up. That is not the case for antitrust. An antitrust article will get blasted across search results. An anti-conservative, the same thing. And I also think, just quickly, I think that the bargain between a user and these platforms needs to be re-explored. People have signed up for using this, not understanding the value of the information they provide to the oligarch owners of these companies. And there needs to be a better decision-making process. You should know how much you're contributing to the worth of these companies before you decide to use them as actively as we all do.
One final question that I'd like to pose to all of you, and if you could all answer very quickly, one at a time. First to you, Justin. Do you think the tech giants are harming the democratic process in the US?
No, I think that they are providing a tremendous service in terms of giving us the platform to communicate with each other. The problem is them not setting hard ground rules and keeping to them in a way that is actively harming their ability to be those free platforms.
Daniel?
No, the people who are harming the democratic process in the U.S. are the Republican and Democratic parties.
And finally, Charles.
I think actually, yes, they are. I think that not enough scrutiny has been given even now to what happened in 2016, to what may have happened in 2012 when our elections, in my view, were rigged.
Thank you all for joining us here on RT International. I've been speaking to Justin Robert Young, host of the Politics podcast, Daniel Lazar, journalist and author, and Charles Ortle, private investor and writer. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here on RT International. We're back in 30 minutes with all the latest. See you then.